Elowyn hadn't expected to find her mate tonight. She certainly hadn't expected to lose him in the same breath. The great hall of Thornwall was suffocating. Hundreds of wolves packed the vaulted chamber, their collective body heat thickening the air until every inhale felt like drinking something warm and heavy. Candlelight caught on polished armor and silk gowns, and the enormous iron chandelier that hung from the ceiling like a jaw full of teeth. And at the center of it all, elevated on a stone dais draped in black and silver, stood Alpha King Soren Vale. Elowyn was not supposed to be looking at him. She was supposed to be invisible. She stood against the far wall with the other palace servants, a tray of wine goblets balanced on her palm. Her eyes fixed on the floor like a good, forgettable nobody. The Luna selection was not for women like her. It was for the 12 highborn candidates arranged in a gleaming crescent before the throne, each one lovelier than the last, each one representing a bloodline and a political alliance worth more than Elowyn's entire existence. She risked a glance upward. Soren moved along the crescent slowly, pausing before each candidate. He was tall enough that the women had to tilt their heads back to meet his gaze, and broad enough that his shadow swallowed them whole when he stopped. His face revealed nothing. Cold gray eyes, a jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as the walls, and a stillness about him that made the air feel heavier wherever he stood. He stopped before the 7th candidate, a striking woman with copper hair and sharp green eyes, Lady Lysara of Ravenmoor. The crowd murmured. Everyone knew this was the political favorite. Lysara's family controlled the northern mountain passes, the only barrier between Thornwall and the Greymarch raiders who had killed 200 civilians last winter. Their alliance would seal that border for good. It was the smart choice, the inevitable choice. Soren's gaze lingered on Lysara for a long moment. Then, without any visible reason, his head turned. He looked across the room, past the candidates, past the nobles, past the guards. His eyes found Elowyn against the wall, and the world ended. The bond hit her like a hand around her throat. Every nerve in her body ignited at once. A white-hot wire pulled taut from the center of her chest, straight to the man standing 40 feet away. Her wolf, dormant and docile her entire 23 years of life, erupted beneath her skin with a howl so fierce, Elowyn nearly dropped the tray. Mate. The word wasn't a thought. It was a physical sensation, branded into her bones. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She could only stare at the Alpha King, who was staring back at her with an expression she would never forget. Shock. Unguarded. Absolute shock. His lips parted. His hand, resting at his side, twitched like he was about to reach for her. For 3 heartbeats, the most powerful wolf in the realm looked at a nameless servant girl like she was the only living thing in the room. Then, the moment shattered. Soren blinked. His jaw tightened. Something shuddered behind his eyes, a door slamming closed so hard she felt it in her chest. He turned away from her, walked back to Lysara, and took her hand. Lady Lysara of Ravenmoor. His voice carried through the hall, steady, commanding, utterly controlled. I name you my Luna. The hall erupted. Cheers, gasps, the thunderous stamping of approval. Lysara smiled, radiant and poised, her fingers curling around the king's like they belonged there. Elowyn's tray hit the floor. The crash of shattering glass was swallowed by the noise of the crowd. No one heard it. No one noticed. No one except the king's beta, Jorin, who stood 3 steps behind the throne and whose sharp brown eyes had followed Soren's gaze to the wall and found exactly what the king had found. Elowyn ran. She shoved through the servants' corridor, her vision blurring, her chest splitting open with a pain so acute she thought she was dying. The bond was alive inside her, blazing and screaming, and on the other end of it, she could feel him. His heartbeat hammering against her ribs like a second pulse. The tight, suffocating control he was exerting to keep his face neutral, to keep his wolf leashed, to keep himself standing beside a woman who was not his mate. He knew. He had felt it too. And he had chosen anyway. Elowen made it to the kitchen stairwell before her legs gave out. She sank against the wall, pressed her fist against her sternum, and tried to breathe through the worst pain she had ever felt in her life. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give this moment that. Instead, she sat in the dark, shaking, and repeated the only thought that made any sense. You are no one. You have no name, no bloodline, no rank. Of course he didn't choose you. Behind her, a footstep echoed in the corridor. Elowen's head snapped up. Joran stood at the top of the stairwell, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't read. Miss Elowen, he said quietly, we need to talk. Joran didn't speak again until he had led her to a small windowless room off the eastern corridor, the kind of room used for storing old ledgers that no one would ever need again. He closed the door behind them, and the silence pressed in. Elowen stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her pulse still hammering, the bond still burning in her chest like a live coal she couldn't spit out. She could feel Soren somewhere above her in the palace, feel the echo of his presence like a compass needle always pointing north. You felt it, Joran said. It wasn't a question. Elowen's throat closed. She considered lying, considered shaking her head and pretending that she'd simply dropped the tray because she was clumsy, that she'd run because she was embarrassed. But Joran's gaze was steady and patient and far too knowing. Yes, she whispered, and the king felt it as well. The words landed like stones dropped into deep water. Elowen stared at him. He chose Lysara. He did, Joran confirmed. Then it doesn't matter what either of us felt. Her voice came out harder than she intended. He made his decision. Joran studied her for a long moment, then exhaled slowly through his nose. Miss Elowen, what I am about to tell you does not leave this room. If it does, I cannot protect you from the consequences. Do you understand? Her stomach turned to ice. Those words were never followed by anything good. The king's choice was political, Joran continued. The Ravenmoor alliance has been in negotiation for over a year. Without it, the northern passes remain unguarded. The Greymarch clans will raid every village north of the Ashpine River, just as they did last winter. He paused. Lady Lysara was not chosen because of affection. She was chosen because the alternative is dead civilians. Elowen said nothing. What could she say? 200 lives versus one servant girl's feelings. The math was simple and brutal and completely reasonable. But there is a complication, Joran added. Elowen waited. The bonding ceremony is in 30 days. For a Luna bond to take hold, the alpha must be able to anchor his wolf to his chosen mate. It requires focus, willingness, and above all, the absence of a competing claim. Joran paused, letting the implication settle. The king has a competing claim. The air left Elowen's lungs. Me. You. Silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. What happens if the bond doesn't take? Elowen asked, her voice barely audible. The ceremony fails. The alliance collapses. Ravenmoor withdraws their protection of the passes. Joran's voice was even, clinical, but his eyes betrayed something else. Worry. And the king's wolf, pulled between a chosen mate it cannot accept and a true mate it cannot reach, begins to tear itself apart. Elowen pressed her hand against the wall to keep herself upright. So he'll die. In time, yes. A wolf divided against itself does not survive. The deterioration is slow at first, then sudden. He will lose the ability to shift. Then he will lose his strength, his senses, his instincts. Eventually, the wolf dies, and the man follows. The room tilted. Elowen closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe. Why are you telling me this? Because you have a choice, Joran said. You can sever the bond. Her eyes flew open. What? There is a ritual. Old, painful, and irreversible. It would cut the mate bond at the root before it has time to fully form. The king would then be free to bond with Lysara. The alliance holds, the border is secured, and you return to your life. Elowin stood perfectly still. The bond pulsed warm and alive, reaching for a man who would never reach back. And the alternative? She asked. Joran's expression shifted into something almost gentle. There is no alternative, Miss Elowin. This is the only path that ends with the king alive. She should have agreed immediately. Every logical part of her brain was screaming at her to nod and say yes and walk away from this nightmare before it consumed her. But her wolf was howling, clawing at the inside of her ribs, and the bond was singing a single devastating note that resonated through every cell in her body. How long do I have to decide? She asked. Joran's jaw tightened. 3 days. I'll send someone for your answer. He opened the door and paused, his hand on the frame. The king does not know I am speaking to you. He would not want you burdened with this choice, but I believe you deserve to make it with open eyes. He left. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a verdict. Elowin sank to the floor and pressed her forehead against her knees. 3 days to decide whether to rip out the only beautiful thing that had ever happened to her in order to save a man who had looked at her like she was the sun and then chosen to live in the dark. She sat there until the candle guttered out and the room went black. When she finally stood, her legs were numb and her decision was already half made. The half she was most afraid of. 3 days passed, and Elowin didn't give her answer. She returned to her work in the palace's lower archives, sorting supply records and grain inventories with hands that trembled when she wasn't concentrating on keeping them still. She ate her meals alone in the servants' hall. She avoided the upper corridors where the king's presence hummed through the bond like a distant heartbeat she couldn't silence. And she watched herself deteriorate. It started small, a persistent ache behind her sternum that no amount of deep breathing could ease. A restlessness that made sleep feel like trying to hold water in her fists. She would wake at odd hours, drenched in sweat, her wolf pacing beneath her skin with a frantic energy that had no outlet. On the second day, she lost her appetite entirely. On the third, her hands shook so badly she spilled ink across an entire ledger and had to spend 2 hours recopying it. On the fourth day, the day after her deadline had passed, Joran found her. He appeared in the archive doorway, his expression carefully neutral. He simply looked at her, taking in the shadows beneath her eyes and the slight tremor in her fingers and the way she gripped the edge of the table like it was the only thing holding her upright. "You didn't answer," he said. "No. The ritual can still be performed, but the window is narrowing." Elowin set down her pen. "How is he?" Joran's neutrality flickered. "He failed to shift this morning during training. His wolf would not come. It lasted only a moment before he forced it, but the soldiers noticed." The ache behind her sternum sharpened into something serrated. "He blamed fatigue," Joran continued. "But his hands were shaking afterward. He hid it well. Not well enough." Elowin stared at the ink-stained ledger in front of her. "I want to see him." Joran blinked. Whatever he had expected her to say, that was not it. "That is inadvisable." "I didn't ask if it was advisable. Your presence near the king will strengthen the competing bond. Every moment you spend in proximity to him accelerates the very problem we are trying to solve. And every moment I spend away from him, I feel like I'm being pulled apart from the inside." Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. "If I'm going to sever this bond, I need to understand what I'm severing. I need to see him. Once." Joran studied her face for a long time. Then he sighed, the kind of sigh that carried the weight of a man who had spent years solving problems for a king who insisted on creating new ones. "Tonight," he said. The king reviews border reports in his war room after the evening meal. I can place you in the adjacent corridor on a pretense. You will have a few minutes, nothing more. He will not know you are there. That evening, Elowen stood in a narrow service corridor that ran behind the war room's eastern wall. A thin wooden partition separated her from the room beyond, and through the gaps in the aging wood, she could see slivers of candlelight and shadow. She could hear his voice, low, measured, controlled, issuing commands about patrol rotations and supply lines with the precision of a man who had been waging wars since before she could read. She pressed her palm flat against the partition and closed her eyes. The bond flared the moment she focused on it. Warmth flooded her chest, rushing down her arms and into her fingertips, and she bit her lip to keep from gasping. She could feel him on the other side of the wall, could feel the exhaustion he was hiding beneath his authority. The tension wound so tight in his body it hummed like a plucked string. And beneath all of it, something else. Something aching and unspoken that he was spending enormous energy pretending didn't exist. He missed her. He didn't know her, had never spoken a word to her, had looked at her for exactly 3 heartbeats before choosing someone else. And yet, through the bond, she could feel his wolf reaching for hers with the wordless need of a creature separated from the only thing that could save it. Elowen's eyes burned. She pressed her forehead against the wood. A chair scraped. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crossed the room. They stopped on the other side of the partition, inches away. She held her breath. Through the gap, she could see his hand pressed against the wall at the exact height of hers. His fingers splayed against the wood like he was feeling for something he couldn't name. His breathing had changed, deeper, rougher, and she heard one of the advisors say something that went unanswered. "Your Majesty?" the advisor repeated. Soren's hand dropped from the wall. "Continue," he said, his voice strained in a way that made Elowen's heart fracture along a line she didn't know existed. He walked back to the table. The briefing resumed. Elowen pulled her hand from the partition and pressed it against her mouth. She couldn't do it. She couldn't sever this bond. Not now. Not after feeling what lived on the other end of it. Not after knowing that he was standing in a room full of commanders with his hand on a wall because his wolf could sense her through the wood. The realization should have brought relief. Instead, it brought terror. Because if she kept the bond, the king couldn't bond with Lysara. If he couldn't bond with Lysara, the alliance collapsed. If the alliance collapsed, people died. And if his wolf stayed divided, he died anyway. Elowen fled the corridor with her heart in her throat and the taste of an impossible choice on her tongue. She made it to the servants' stairwell before a voice stopped her cold. "You were told to observe," Joran said from the shadows behind her. "Not to make contact through the wall." Elowen spun. "I didn't make contact, I just stood there." "You stood there," and the king stopped mid-sentence, crossed a room, and pressed his hand against the exact spot where yours was resting, in front of 6 military advisors who are now wondering why their alpha is communing with the architecture. Joran's voice was level, but something flickered in his expression that looked dangerously close to fear. "This bond is stronger than I anticipated. Stronger than anything I've seen." Elowen's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" Joran was quiet for a moment. "It means the severing ritual may no longer work." Elowen was summoned to the healer's wing the following morning by a woman she had never met. Brenna was old in the way that mountains are old, not frail but weathered, sharpened by time into something harder and more essential than she had been before. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and her pale blue eyes moved over Elowen's face with the clinical precision of someone cataloging symptoms. "Sit," Brenna said, gesturing to a wooden chair in the center of the examination room. Elowen sat. The room smelled of dried sage and something sharper underneath, something medicinal that stung the back of her throat. "Joran tells me you've refused the severing," Brenna said, pulling a stool close and settling onto it. I haven't refused. I just haven't agreed. Brenna's mouth twitched. A distinction that matters less with every passing hour. Give me your wrist. Elowen extended her arm, and Brenna's cool fingers closed around it. The healer went still, her eyes unfocusing slightly, and Elowen felt a gentle probing sensation that seemed to move through her pulse and into the deeper currents of her body. Your wolf is fully awake, Brenna murmured. You were dormant before the selection. Yes, low wolf presence, minimal instinct, no shifting urge? I've never shifted, Elowen confirmed. They told me my wolf was weak, underdeveloped, consistent with having no pack bloodline. Brenna made a non-committal sound and released her wrist. She crossed to a shelf lined with glass jars and leather-bound journals, running her finger along the spines until she found what she was looking for. Tell me about the bond, Brenna said without looking up. Exactly what you feel. Elowen hesitated, but Brenna's voice carried the quiet authority of a woman who had heard worse and kept it to herself. It feels like a thread, Elowen began, running from the center of my chest to his. When I'm close to him, it hums. When I'm far away, it pulls. And when he's in pain, it burns. And you can feel his emotions? Not clearly, more like weather. I can feel the pressure change, even if I can't name the storm. Brenna looked up. That level of empathic resonance doesn't develop this quickly in a standard mate bond. Not in 4 days, not without physical contact. She paused. Have you touched him? No. Never. Then this bond was forming before the selection. Elowen's world tilted. That's not possible. I'd never even been in the same room with him. Proximity isn't always physical, Brenna said. There are bonds that form across distance, across time, even across lifetimes. They're exceedingly rare, but the old texts describe them. A soul bond, forged before either party is aware of it, waiting for the moment of recognition to activate. Elowen shook her head. Soul bonds are legends, bedtime stories. So are wolves who never shift until the age of 23, and then wake up with a bond strong enough to reach through walls. Brenna's tone was dry but not unkind. Your body is telling a story your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Before Elowen could respond, the door opened. Joran stepped inside, and the look on his face made her stomach clench. The king collapsed during the morning assembly, he said. Elowen was on her feet before she knew she was moving. Is he alive? He's conscious. Barely. His wolf failed mid-sentence. He went down in front of the entire court. Joran's composure was intact, but his voice was tight. Lysara attempted to stabilize him through their engagement link. It didn't work. Of course it didn't work, Brenna said sharply. You can't stabilize a wolf that's tearing itself apart trying to reach someone else. Joran looked at Elowen. He's asking for you. The words didn't make sense. He doesn't know me. He's asking for the woman from the selection, the one with dark hair who stood against the western wall. He described you 3 times before Lysara left the room in tears. Joran's jaw tightened. The court is in an uproar. The Ravenmore delegation is demanding an explanation, and the king is lying on the floor of the assembly hall because his wolf would rather die than bond with anyone who isn't you. Elowen couldn't feel her hands. She couldn't feel anything except the bond roaring inside her, pulling her toward him with a force that made thought irrelevant. Take me to him, she said. Joran led her through corridors she had never walked before, up staircases she didn't know existed, past guards who stared and whispered as she passed. The palace's upper levels were a different world, all carved stone and woven tapestries, and the heavy scent of beeswax candles. They reached a set of heavy double doors flanked by 2 guards. Joran said, "Open the doors." The guards obeyed. The king's private chambers were enormous, lined with weapons and maps, and the accumulated weight of a man who carried an entire kingdom on his back. And there, On the floor beside an overturned chair sat Soren Weil with his back against the wall, and his head bowed, and his hands gripping his own forearms so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He looked up when the door opened. His gray eyes found Elowen immediately, unerringly, as though she were the only source of gravity in the room. And then the bond between them, that burning, pulling, desperate thread she'd been carrying for 4 days, went quiet. Not gone, not diminished, but settled. Like a wild animal that had finally been allowed to come home. Soren's grip on his arms loosened. The rigid line of his shoulders dropped. And though his expression didn't change, his breathing did, deepening from shallow and ragged to something slower, steadier, more human. Nobody spoke. The guards stared. Joran stood motionless in the doorway. Elowen took a step closer, then another. She knelt on the floor 3 feet from the Alpha King and said the only thing that made sense. "I'm here." Soren looked at her. Up close, the damage was worse than she had imagined. His skin was ashen, his eyes hollowed, the sharp bones of his face too prominent beneath skin that should have belonged to a man in his prime. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He looked like he was dying. "You shouldn't be," he said, his voice rough. "Probably not," she agreed. Something flickered across his face. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. "Your name," he said. "Tell me your name." "Elowen." He repeated it quietly, almost to himself, and the bond hummed with warmth. Behind them, Joran closed the doors. The lock clicked into place. And from somewhere deep in the palace, carried faintly through stone and silence, Elowen heard the sound of the Ravenmoor delegation's carriages being prepared in the courtyard. The alliance was crumbling. And she had just become the reason why. The arrangement was simple. Elowen stayed. Brenna called it proximity stabilization, a clinical term that made it sound like a medical procedure rather than what it actually was, which was a nameless servant girl sleeping in the Alpha King's chambers because his wolf would die without her. A cot was brought in. Narrow, hard, positioned against the far wall as far from the king's bed as the room would allow. Elowen sat on the edge of it that first evening and stared at the distance between her thin wool blanket and the enormous canopied bed and felt every inch of that gap like a wound. Soren sat at his desk, his back to her, reviewing the same document he had been staring at for 20 minutes without turning a page. "You don't have to stay awake on my account," Elowen said. "I'm reading." "You've been on the same page since I sat down." His pen stopped moving. "You're observant. And you're stalling." Then Soren set down his pen and looked at her properly for the first time since she had entered the room. "I need you to understand something," he said. "This arrangement exists because my wolf requires your proximity to survive. That is the beginning and the end of it. I will not touch you. I will not speak to you about anything that isn't directly related to this situation. And when a cure is found, this ends." Elowen met his gaze. "Understood. Good. Can I at least have a better pillow?" Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, the faintest crack in the stone. "I'll have one sent." She lay on the cot that night and listened to him breathe. The bond purred softly, content just to be near him, and for the first time in days, the ache behind her sternum eased enough for her to close her eyes. When she opened her eyes, pale morning light filled the room. Soren was already dressed, standing by the window with a cup of something that steamed in the cool air. He glanced at her, then away. "You slept," he said, and it wasn't clear whether he was asking or accusing. "So did you," Elowen replied, sitting up. And he had. She could see it in the slight softening of the shadows beneath his eyes, the fractional easing of the tension that lived permanently in his shoulders. His wolf had steadied in the night, and both of them knew why. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Elowin continued her work in the archives during the day, while whispers followed her through every corridor. The palace knew. Not the details, but enough. The king had collapsed, the Ravenmoor engagement was faltering, and a servant girl no one had ever noticed before was suddenly spending her nights in the royal chambers. The rumors were unkind. Elowin pretended not to hear them. In the evenings, she arrived at his chambers after the palace quieted. Soren worked at his desk. Elowin sat on her cot. They did not speak. The arrangement was clinical, exactly as he had demanded, and it lasted precisely 4 days before it started to unravel. It was the candle that did it. On the third evening, Elowin arrived to find a beeswax candle on the small table beside her cot, the expensive kind that burned clean and golden, not the tallow stubs she was used to. She said nothing. The next evening, there was a second blanket folded at the foot of her cot, thick and soft and entirely too fine for a servant. On the fifth night, Soren spoke without looking up from his maps. The eastern border villages, 3 of them report contaminated well water. Your archives would have the geological survey from 6 years ago. Can you locate it? You're asking me for help? I'm asking you for a document. She brought it the following evening along with 2 related surveys. He studied them without comment. But that night he said, "The additional surveys were useful." "You're welcome." "I didn't thank you." "You were about to." The silence that followed felt different than the ones before. Warmer. On the 7th night, Elowin told him about the time she had misfiled an entire year of tax records during her first month in the archives and spent 3 days in a panic reconstructing them. Soren listened without interrupting. She thought he had fallen asleep until she finished and heard him say, very quietly, "Did anyone notice?" The head archivist found out 2 months later. He was furious. And I cried. Extensively. In a supply closet. Then, so softly she almost missed it, Soren laughed. It was barely a sound, more a breath expelled through his nose, but it changed the temperature of the room entirely. Elowin smiled into the dark and pressed her face against her pillow. This was dangerous. She knew it was dangerous. Every small moment, every quiet exchange, every thread of connection being woven between them was making the inevitable end worse. When the cure was found, when the arrangement ended, when she went back to her cot in the servants' quarters and her invisible life, the loss would be devastating. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, his wolf was steady, his breathing was deep, and somewhere in the quiet, she could feel the bond between them humming like a lullaby. On the 8th morning, Brinna summoned her. The healer's examination room felt different this time. The journals on the table had multiplied, and several lay open to pages marked with strips of cloth. Brinna's expression carried a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Sit," Brinna said. Elowin sat. Brinna took her wrist again, closed her eyes, and held on for much longer than last time. When she released it, her face had gone very still. "Your wolf is not dormant," Brinna said slowly. "I know. It woke during the selection." "No, you misunderstand me." Brinna picked up one of the open journals and turned it to face Elowin. "Your wolf was never weak or underdeveloped. It was sealed. Deliberately, skillfully, and at enormous cost. Someone bound your wolf when you were an infant, and whatever they used was designed to ensure it never surfaced." The room went very cold. "Who would do that?" Elowin whispered. "Someone who needed to hide what you are." Brinna's pale eyes bored into hers. "Because what I'm sensing beneath that seal is not the wolf of a nameless foundling. It's something much, much older." Brinna turned to a second journal, this one so ancient its leather cover was cracked and peeling, and opened it to a page she had marked with a red thread. "There is a symbol," Brinna said, "associated with the royal bloodline of the Ashenmere pack. A pack that was destroyed 23 years ago, its ruling family slaughtered, its lands burned, its history erased. She paused. Every member of that bloodline carried a mark. It manifested at birth, just below the left collarbone. Elowen stopped breathing. "Show me your chest," Brenna said. The mark was there. It had always been there. A small, pale shape just below Elowen's left collarbone, no larger than a thumbnail. She had assumed it was a birthmark, but under Brenna's examination, it was unmistakable. 3 interlocking crescents forming a wolf's eye, the seal of the Ashenmere royal house. The Ashenmere pack was ruled by a queen, Brenna continued. Their line passed through the female bloodline, mother to daughter, for over 400 years. When the pack was destroyed, the entire royal family was believed killed. She paused. There were rumors that the queen's youngest daughter, barely a month old, was carried from the burning stronghold by a nursemaid who sealed the child's wolf and left her at the gates of a distant kingdom. Elowen couldn't speak. 23 years of being no one. 23 years of making herself small and useful and invisible because she had no name, no bloodline, no right to exist beyond what she could offer others. And now this woman was telling her she was the heir to a kingdom of ashes. "Does Soren know?" Elowen asked. "Not yet." "Don't tell him." Brenna's eyebrows rose. "This changes everything, child. If you are the Ashenmere heir, the mate bond is not a complication. It is a legitimized union that would make the Ravenmoor alliance unnecessary." "I said don't tell him." Elowen's voice came out sharper than she intended. "If he accepts me, I want it to be because of the bond. Not because my blood makes me politically convenient." Brenna studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You have your mother's stubbornness. I knew Queen Aelith. She would have said the same thing." That evening, Elowen entered Soren's chambers and found him standing in the center of the room with Joran at his side and an expression she had never seen before. Cold, resolved, final. "The Ravenmoor delegation has issued an ultimatum," Soren said. "Bond with Lysara within 7 days, or they withdraw from the border accord entirely. The Grey March Raiders will have a clear path to every village north of the Ashpine River." Elowen stood very still. "And the bond with Lysara? Can it work now?" "Brenna believes my wolf may accept a secondary bond if the primary one is temporarily suppressed." Soren's voice was controlled to the point of cruelty. "If you leave the palace entirely, the southern provinces, at minimum." The room was silent except for the fire. "Is this what you want?" she asked him directly. "It is what's necessary." "That isn't what I asked." "It's the only answer I can give." His voice was rough, scraped at the edges. "People will die, Elowen. If the border falls, hundreds of families lose everything. I will not bury more of my people because I was too selfish to let go of something I was never meant to have. Something I was never meant to have." That was how he saw her. Not as his mate. As an indulgence he couldn't afford. She wanted to tell him about the mark, about Ashenmere, about the queen's blood in her veins. But she would not be chosen for her bloodline. She would be chosen for herself. Or not at all. "When do I leave?" she asked, her voice perfectly steady. "Tomorrow," Joran said quietly. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did he. She lay on the cot and felt his wolf reaching for hers across 6 feet of empty air, and she reached back because she could not help it. And they held each other through the bond in silence until dawn turned the windows gray. In the morning, she was gone before he woke. She made it to the courtyard before her legs failed. The cobblestones rushed up to meet her, and the last thing she heard before consciousness dissolved was a voice shouting her name from somewhere high above, in a tone she had never heard from him before. Terrified. Then darkness. She woke in the healer's wing with Brenna's face above her and the taste of iron on her tongue. "The bond is rejecting the separation," Brenna said, her voice tight. "Your body is shutting down. If you leave this palace, you will not survive the journey." "And if I stay?" If you stay and the king bonds with Lysara, the competing bond will tear your wolf apart instead. Elowyn stared at the ceiling. So I die either way. Brenna's hand closed over hers. Not if the king chooses you. The door burst open. Soren stood in the frame, chest heaving, his face a wreckage of fear and fury. His eyes found Elowyn, and something in his expression collapsed so completely she could almost hear it. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropped to his knees beside her, and took her face in both hands. His palms were shaking. "Don't you ever do that again," he said. "Don't you ever collapse in my courtyard and stop breathing for 9 seconds while I watch from a window and can't get to you in time." 9 seconds? Elowyn whispered. I counted every one. His forehead dropped against hers. Behind them, Brenna quietly closed the door. "The border," Elowyn started. "I don't care." "You do care. That's the problem." His thumb traced along her cheekbone, trembling. "I have been a king since I was 19 years old," Soren said, his voice barely audible. "Every decision I have made has been for my people. Every sacrifice, every alliance, every sleepless night. I have given them everything, my youth, my freedom, my future, and I would do it again." He pulled back just enough to look at her. "But I cannot give them you. I have tried. For 8 days I have tried to be the king who puts duty above all else, and I have failed, because my wolf knows what I have been too afraid to say." Elowyn's vision blurred with tears. "What?" "You are mine," he said. "You have been mine since before I knew your name. And I would rather lose every alliance in this kingdom than lose you." "That's a terrible political strategy," Elowyn whispered. He laughed, broken and wet. "I know." She pulled him down and kissed him. The moment their lips met, the bond ignited. Not a hum, not a glow, but a detonation. Heat flooded through her body, racing through her blood and bones. She felt his wolf surge forward to meet hers, felt the two of them collide with a force that shook something fundamental loose in the marrow of her being. When they broke apart, gasping, his irises had turned molten silver, his wolf burning so close to the surface she could almost see it looking back at her. "Mate," he said, and the word resonated through the bond like a bell. Brenna's voice cut through from across the room. "Before you complete that bond, there is something you both need to know." They turned. Brenna stood by the table with the ancient journal open in her hands. "Elowyn is not a foundling," Brenna said. "She is the last surviving heir of the Ashenmere royal bloodline, the Lost Wolf Queen." The room went absolutely silent. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, carried by wind and distance, came the sound of Ravenmoor war horns. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then everything happened at once. Soren pulled Elowyn behind him on pure instinct. Joran appeared in the doorway at the sound of the war horns, blade drawn. "Scouts report 300 riders approaching from the northern road," Joran said. "Flying Ravenmoor banners. They'll reach the outer walls within the hour." 300 is not an army," Soren said, his eyes narrowing. "It's a threat." "Or a vanguard," Joran countered. Soren turned to Brenna. "Explain." "Everything." Brenna spoke with controlled urgency. 23 years ago, the Ashenmere Pack was destroyed in a single night. The official history says it was a border conflict. She paused. "The official history is a lie." Elowyn gripped Soren's arm. "Ashenmere was betrayed from within," Brenna continued. "Someone who knew the guard rotations, the escape routes, the location of the royal nursery." Her pale eyes settled on Soren. "The attack was coordinated by House Fenwick of Ravenmoor." Soren went rigid. "Lysara's family." "Her grandfather ordered the assault. He wanted Ashenmere's territory and their northern trade routes. The current Lord Fenwick inherited the stolen lands and built Ravenmoor's wealth on Ashenmere's ashes." She paused. "And the Grey March raiders who terrorized the northern border?" They operate from Ashenmere's former territory the Fenwicks claim to protect, but have never once secured. The raids that drove you to seek the Ravenmoor alliance were never random. They were leverage. The color drained from Soren's face. He took a step backward, his hand finding the edge of the table. The alliance he had pursued, the bond he had nearly destroyed himself to honor, the woman he had chosen at the cost of his own mate, all of it had been built on a foundation of blood and extortion. Elowyn felt his horror through the bond, a wave of revulsion and self-recrimination so intense it made her flinch. "The war horns," Elowyn whispered. "They're not coming because you rejected Lysara. They're coming because someone told them about me." "Who else knows about the mark?" Soren asked Brenna. "Only myself, and now you. But I requested the Ashenmere journals from the restricted archive 3 days ago. The request would have passed through the records office." "Which is staffed by palace servants," Joran finished, "at least 2 of whom arrived with the Ravenmoor delegation." Soren's voice shifted into something Elowyn hadn't heard before. Not the measured control of a politician. Something harder, forged in whatever crucible had made him king at 19. "Close the gates, recall the border guard, every Ravenmoor envoy in this palace, detained within the quarter hour." "And Lady Lysara?" Joran asked. "Detained. Respectfully, but detained." Joran vanished. Soren turned to Elowyn with an expression so tender it made her throat ache. "I chose them over you," he said quietly. "I nearly bonded with the daughter of the family that destroyed yours." "You didn't know." "That doesn't make it less unforgivable." Elowyn took his face in her hands. "You are not the man who hurt me, Soren. You fought the bond because you thought it was the right thing to do. You were wrong, but you were wrong for the right reasons. Stop punishing yourself for being a good king." "I don't deserve you," he said. "Probably not. But your wolf chose well, so take the win." He kissed her. Slow and deliberate, the kind of kiss that was a vow wrapped in a breath. "Complete the bond with me," he said. "Now, before the battle." "Is that a command from my king?" "It's a plea from your mate." He carried her through the corridor to his chambers, moving through the chaos of a palace preparing for siege with her in his arms like she was the only thing that mattered. The guards saw and said nothing. The servants saw and looked away. Elowyn could hear shouted orders and the grinding of the gate mechanism below, but all of it felt distant, muffled, as though the bond had wrapped them both in a silence that belonged only to them. When the door closed behind them, the world outside ceased to exist. He set her down slowly, his hands lingering at her waist, and looked at her with an expression that held nothing back. No walls, no control, no careful distance. Just him, open and vulnerable, and entirely hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." Every touch was a conversation, his hands tracing the lines of her face, her fingers finding the scars on his shoulders that told stories he had never spoken aloud. The world narrowed to warmth and breath, and the steady golden pulse of the bond drawing them closer. When the mating bite came, it was simultaneous. His teeth found the curve of her neck at the same instant hers found his, and the bond detonated into completion. It crashed through her with the force of a wave breaking, golden and fierce and absolute, locking them together at a level deeper than flesh, deeper than thought. Elowyn gasped and felt the seal on her wolf crack. Not gently. It shattered like glass struck by a hammer, and what poured through was a power so vast and ancient it eclipsed everything she had ever understood about herself. Her wolf surged forward. Not the small, dormant creature she had been told she carried, but something immense and luminous that flooded the room with energy that made the candle flames leap and the stone walls tremble. Soren pulled back, his eyes wide. Elowyn. She was glowing, A pale, silvery light emanated from beneath her skin, concentrated around the mark below her collarbone, which was no longer a faded blemish, but a burning sigil pulsing in time with her heartbeat. The Ashenmere Wolf Queen was waking up, and 300 Ravenmoor riders were at the gates. The light pouring from Alawan's skin filled the chamber like a flood breaking through a dam. The mark below her collarbone blazed, 3 interlocking crescents burning so brightly she could see their reflection in Soren's widened eyes. Her wolf was enormous. She could feel it unfurling inside her like something that had been folded into an impossibly small space for 23 years and was finally stretching to its true size. The power was overwhelming, a river forced through a channel too narrow to hold it. Her vision fractured into layered spectrums she had never seen before, heat signatures and movement trails and the luminous threads of pack bonds glowing like spider silk throughout the palace. She could feel every wolf in Thornwall turning toward her, hundreds of them lifting their heads as something ancient stirred in their blood and recognized what she was. Elowen. Soren's hands found her shoulders. "Stay with me." She focused on him, on his face, on his eyes, on the bond between them burning steady and golden amid the silver storm of her awakening. "I'm here. I just feel like I'm about to fly apart." "You won't. I've got you." The war horn sounded again, closer, and the chamber shuddered with the distant percussion of hooves. Soren's expression hardened. He crossed to the wall, pulled down a sword, and turned to her. "Stay here," he said. "No." She saw the argument forming behind his eyes, the instinct to shield, to protect, to put himself between her and everything sharp. "Soren," Elowen said, and she was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "You spent 8 days trying to protect me from yourself. You sent me away. You chose another woman. You nearly let your wolf die rather than let me close." The silver light moved with her as she rose. "I spent 23 years protecting the world from knowing I existed. Hiding, shrinking, apologizing for taking up space in rooms I had every right to stand in." She took a breath. The light pulsed brighter, and somewhere beneath the fear and the strangeness and the overwhelming tide of power, she felt something else. Something that had been waiting her entire life to surface. Not the wolf, not the bloodline, not the crown or the kingdom or the ancient magic singing through her veins. It was simpler than that. It was the quiet, fierce certainty of a woman who had finally decided she was worth fighting for. "I am done hiding." Something shifted in his expression. Not surrender. Recognition. He looked at her the way he had during the selection, as though she were the only real thing in a room full of shadows. "Then we go together," he said. They descended through the palace side by side, Soren armed in hastily buckled steel, Alawan barefoot with silver light bleeding through her clothes. Guards fell in behind them. Servants pressed against walls. Jorn met them at the main staircase with a report delivered at a dead run. "Fennec demands the surrender of the Ashenmere heir. He claims she is a war criminal descended from a hostile bloodline." "A war criminal," Elowen repeated. "A month-old baby carried out of a burning building. That is his war criminal." They reached the main gate. Beyond the iron lattice, Fenwick's riders had assembled in a broad crescent. 300 mounted wolves in Ravenmoor black, their alpha at the center. A silver-haired man with the satisfied expression of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Soren stepped forward, but Elowen moved past him. She heard Jorn's sharp intake of breath, felt Soren's hand brush her arm, and then, after a fractional hesitation, let go. She walked to the gate alone. Every Thornwall soldier she passed went still, their wolves responding to the ancient power rolling off her in waves. Elowen stopped at the lattice and looked through it at Lord Fenwick. "You burned Ashenmere," she said, and her voice carried across the courtyard with a resonance that didn't belong to a servant girl. You murdered my mother. You slaughtered my people and stole their lands and built your fortune on their bones. And then you sent your daughter to marry the king so that no one would ever look too closely at where Ravenmore's wealth came from. Fennec's expression flickered. You are a servant, a nameless foundling with delusions. Elowen gripped the iron bars and the shift took her. It was nothing like she had imagined. It was not painful or slow or uncertain. It was a door flung open, a breath released after 23 years of holding. Her body dissolved and reformed, and where a barefoot woman had stood, a wolf now filled the gateway. She was enormous, pure white from nose to tail, luminous, her fur radiating the same silver light. Her eyes blazed like twin moons. She was twice the size of any wolf Fenwick's riders had ever seen, and when she raised her head and howled, the sound split the night open. It was not a war cry, it was a declaration, a name spoken after 23 years of silence. Every wolf in Thornwall answered. Not by choice, but by instinct, by blood, by something coded so deep in the marrow of their kind that no amount of politics could erase it. 300 voices rose from the palace and the city beyond, a chorus of recognition that shook the ground beneath Fenwick's horses. The Ravenmore riders broke. Horses rearing, wolves whimpering, riders struggling to control mounts that wanted to flee from something their animal brains understood far better than their riders did. Fenwick stared at her, and his composure crumbled. She could smell his fear, the fear of a man watching the consequences of a 23-year-old crime rise up and look him in the eye. Elowen shifted back. She stood at the gate, barefoot on cold stone, silver light settling around her. Leave, she said. Return the Ashenmere lands. Release the families your father displaced, and pray that I am more merciful than you were. Fenwick's horse retreated. This is not over, he said, but the words were hollow. It was over the moment you rode here. You just didn't know it yet. She turned her back on him. 300 riders, and she turned her back on them, because a queen does not watch her enemies retreat. She walks toward her people. Soren stood 10 paces behind her, his sword lowered, his face carrying an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Pride, awe, love, and something quieter. The look of a man who had spent his whole life carrying a kingdom alone and was realizing he didn't have to. Her bare feet were freezing. Her clothes were torn at the seams. She was shaking with the aftershock of a power she didn't yet understand. Your gates could use better hinges, she said. Soren laughed. It was the fullest sound she had ever heard from him, joyful and helpless, and he caught her in his arms and lifted her off the cold stones and held her against his chest. My queen, he murmured into her hair. Behind them, the Ravenmore riders disappeared into the dark. And in the doorway of the healer's wing, Brenna watched with tears on her weathered cheeks, clutching the ancient journal to her chest, and whispered, Welcome home, child. The bond didn't solve everything. Elowen learned that quickly. Ravenmore's surrender was slow and bitter, negotiated over months of tense correspondence, and one very memorable incident where Soren threw a diplomatically worded letter into the fireplace and said something profoundly unkingly about Lord Fenwick's ancestry. The Ashenmere lands were returned, piece by piece, and the displaced families began the long, fragile process of going home. Lysara sought Elowen out before she departed Thornwall. She stood stiff and pale in the corridor outside the royal chambers. I didn't know, she said, about what my family did. Elowen studied her face and believed her. I know. He never looked at me the way he looks at you. Not once. A thin, careful smile. I hope you make him happy. I intend to make him exasperated, Elowen replied. Happiness will be a side effect. Lysara laughed, surprised and brief, and Elowen decided she didn't hate her at all. So Elowen stood before the court in the same great hall where she had once served wine as a nameless servant, wearing a crown forged from Ashenmere silver, recovered from the ruins of her mother's stronghold. Soren placed it on her head, with hands that were perfectly steady and eyes that were not. When she turned to face the court, the great hall erupted, not with the polite applause of political obligation, but with the howl. Hundreds of wolves raising their voices in the same chorus of recognition that had answered her at the gate, and this time Elowyn howled back. The whispers never fully stopped. A foundling queen, a servant Luna. But Soren was there, every morning steady and solid, with a dry observation about whichever noble had most recently offended his queen's dignity. And every night, his arms around her, his wolf settled against hers, the bond humming warm and golden between them. On a quiet morning, months after the coronation, Elowyn woke to pale light filtering through the curtains. Soren lay beside her, still asleep, his breathing deep and even, one arm draped across her waist. His face was peaceful. His wolf was whole. She watched him for a moment, warmth blooming in her chest. Then she shifted closer, tucked herself against his shoulder, and let her eyes drift closed. Somewhere far to the north, Ashenmere families were rebuilding homes on land that was finally theirs again. And in the great hall far below, servants were setting out goblets for the morning assembly, goblets that someone else would carry now. The lost wolf queen slept beside her king, exactly where she belonged.